My name is Tanya Hall, and I'm with the Purdue Extension host team. As you noticed, our theme for this year's conference is creating connections at every crossroads. So in keeping in mind with that theme, I am excited to introduce our Capnote speakers from the Community Initiatives Network. Our speakers, Monte, Roulier, and Stacy, Wegley, have a wealth of experience in helping develop collaborative teams via community partnerships to foster meaningful community engagement while using data and storytelling to create effective change strategies. The goal is to advance healthy, equitable communities work while resulting in healthier people and places. You have likely seen them participating in the conference this week, and now they'll be engaging us in an interactive session to explore how we as individuals, as well as an extension system, can create connections for thriving together. So please help me welcome Monte and Stacy.
Thank you, Tanya, and good morning, everyone. It's really an honor to join you for this Capnote, the close of what has been really an extraordinary gathering, and I commend everybody who's helped organize this. It's really an amazing. I know that that's kind of a shared sentiment in talking with you all informally, that just being part of this community and everybody who's led workshops and after-hours sessions and showed up. It was really an amazing event, and Stacy and I just have been incredibly impressed by kind of the quality of content and the quality of community and really the spirit of dialogue that has showed up here. And in many ways, I think it reflects that we are at a historic moment in our country and really a unique moment for extension, for community development, for the communities that we serve. And I think it feels like there's some rich, almost paradox conversations that Stacy and I were observing in and out of our time together. And those paradoxes show up in the form of celebrating and lamenting. You all really took the time to really intentionally celebrate all the goodness of the recent couple of years, and looking back 50 years of the Regional Rural Resource Network, really incredible bright spots in the works that you all are doing in COVID and substance use and some of these newer areas for extension, and also taking time to lament. I was really moved by how Michael Wilcox really laid out the land acknowledgement in a heartfelt way, and not just as an acknowledgement, as a call to action, really thinking about some of the past injuries and harm that even gave rise to this system, and even some lament of how we've not always been there to show up for everyone in our communities. And I think there's some really courageous conversations that were taking place in this mix of celebrating and lamenting. As one of the paradoxes. Another paradox was the reach, just this national network that has extraordinary reach across our communities that you know. Not always operating as a national network, but recognizing that we have this incredible power, and yet we're stretched. We're experiencing burnout. Many of us have been at this for a long time. We're operating with low personnel. So this paradox of incredible reach and incredible stretch. Did you hear some of that in these conversations? The paradox of the incredible puzzle pieces that you all bring in the forms of applied research and programs and practices and capacities for communities, and asking honest questions around, are these the right puzzle pieces, and do they always fit together at different geographies, or the puzzle pieces our communities need for the future? And so I feel this spirit of real generativity, and I think anytime we are in conversations of paradox, it's a time to really think about how we reimagine what community development looks like in the future, and I think those were active conversations, what extension looks like in the future. And Stacy and I hope that we can have a little bit of space to kind of name some things that were bubbling up for you over the last couple of days. I also heard a lot of hope in the conversations, a lot of hope, and a lot of it is just being in community again. That's so important. We're wired for that. So I just want to say we commend you and are so grateful to be part of this experience in the community that you've created here. And we've been asked to just share a little bit, as you heard from Tanya, what is it that we know and are learning about thriving together at this particular moment in time? And this is something that I know everybody in this room knows a fair amount about. And so I don't think there's a lot that Stacy and I could share that would be radically new, but in some ways it may not be our job. I'm going to start with a story, and the moral is that we only learn what we already know. And it starts in a place in the northwest Himalayan mountains, a village that's really the crossroads. And hears that there's a wise person in a village next to them and wants to have this village person come and impart wisdom in their community, and comes to the equivalent of the village square. And she starts with the question, do you know what it is I'm going to tell you? And the villagers there say, no. She says, well, you only learn what you already know, so there's really no reason for me to speak, and leaves. Perplexed, they decide to give it another try. In a couple weeks, she comes back, same place, same square, same question. Do you know what it is I'm going to share with you, what I'm going to tell you? And this time, yes. She says, wonderful. Well, then there's really no reason for me to speak. And she leaves. A few of them decide, get the courage, have the energy to give it one more try. She comes back, same place, same square, same crowd, with the same question. Do you know what it is that I'm going to share with you? And on this side of the square, the chorus of yeses. And on this side of the square, a chorus of yeses or no's. And she says, wonderful, this side, tell this side. And leaves and doesn't return. And that night, one of the village elders came down and said, I had a dream, and I think I understand exactly what she was trying to tell us, is that we have everything that we need here. The wisdom is here if we just turn towards each other in these times. And I think this is a sentiment that any of us that do community development work, and many of you have been doing it for your whole careers, know is true. But there's sometimes a gap between what we know is true and how we practice it. And I heard this parable for the first time from John McKnight. Many familiar with John McKnight and the Asset-Based Community Development Center? He was an early mentor. 25 years ago, he told this story to our team as we were starting to form, and reminding us that the only way that we're going to create thriving communities is when we turn towards each other, when we tap into those assets present in our communities. And all of our research and all of our experience have told us one thing that give us any chance to create thriving, sustainable, equitable communities, and that's people working in groups and working in a spirit of stewardship. So that's what I want to just kind of lift up for us. What does it take today to create thriving communities? What does it look like to do this work with a spirit and the practices of shared stewards, and really open it up for you all to do some reflecting on that? And to do that, I'm going to just jump into, I think I have a clicker, right, Stacy? Right at the beginning of the pandemic, the Community Initiatives team and the Wellbeing Trust were asked by our partners, our federal partners, that many of them an early forming kind of interagency group for long-term recovery and resilience, to say, what's the civil society? What are non-governmental organizations? What are community-based groups? How are they seeing this early stages of the pandemic that looks like it could be quite severe? And how might we recover with greater resilience, with greater humanity? What does it look like from their point of view? And kind of fast forward, and Stacy might do a double click on this. What I'm going to share with you is actually formed the basis of the Interagency Plan for Long-Term Recovery and Resilience of 30 interagency groups, from USDA that you work with, and NIFA, to HUD and FEMA, and a lot of other federal agencies are using this plan to kind of inform in the ethos of it. But this was really started for us with a spirit of inquiry, with 100 other contributors, and a lot more than that, but in this very short period of time. And it started with this question of, how might we recover and convert this unprecedented adversity that we're facing? We started this process 3 weeks before the murder of George Floyd. But we knew that this was more than just a pandemic. Those of us around the table knew that it was going to be a lot of other types of pandemics and adversity facing our country and our communities. And we wanted to plan for something more than just COVID. And we started with the same premise in the parable I just shared with you. How do we tap into this immense reservoir of resilience and assets that are present in our communities? That has to be our way forward as a country. And how might we start to organize around one unifying, measurable goal, and that is all people, all places thriving. And as many of you know, thriving is actually a measurable thing. Gallup has been measuring thriving for a couple of decades. How many of you have heard of Cantrell's ladder? It's a self-evaluation question. It's a two-part question. Where would you put yourself on a scale of 0 to 10 in best possible life? And where would you put yourself on a scale of 0 to 10 best possible life 5 years from now? And the calculation of those two questions allow us to see who's thriving, suffering, and struggling in terms of a measurement strategy, self-report. And this social science indicator is one of the strongest social science indicators that we know of. It's been around for decades, and it's been used in communities across the globe, across lifespan. And so you can see in this little chart how it's dipped during the Great Recession of 2008, how it started to take a nosedive in the earlier stages of the pandemic. So it's one way of a loose proxy for well-being or thriving is this simple indicator. What we also knew as a collective is that what shapes people's feeling about how they think, feel, and function, about whether they are thriving or suffering or struggling, is the vital conditions. It's the qualities of place, of institutions, and our relationships. That's something that I know you all know and live by. Yeah? And so this framework, these 7 vital conditions, is a comprehensive view of everything that every human being needs, no matter where they are and what part of the globe and where they are in their life course, in order to thrive. And there's different ways of saying it, but these 7 vital conditions is a bridging framework that is starting to be used by the federal government, by local communities, by social impact investors. It doesn't usurp important frameworks that HUD and the Community Capitals framework or any others that people are using, but it's a simple, plain-spoken bridging framework, much in the spirit of Ignite and asset-based development, that doesn't say there's these abstract determinants, but these are the things that we need to put in place if people are going to thrive. And those are, and what we asked all of our contributors in the early stages is, how might we recover? What would be the pivotal moves? What would be the trend-bending investments and strategies that would allow us to thrive based on any of these intersecting vital conditions? So we had folks like, the Children in Nature Network that were looking at thriving natural environment, which means access to sustainable resources, right? It's about access to green spaces. It's about freedom from climate disaster that many of you are describing that in the West and other parts of our country are contending with now and will continue to contend with. So what does it look like to put strategies in place around that? So there's a number of pivotal strategies and long-term strategies and metrics around that. Basic needs, which includes access to routine physical health, freedom from harm, trauma, violence, our mental health system and behavioral health, of public health infrastructure, and sustainable food, access to food. So that all fits within basic needs. So we had groups like the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, Trust for America's Health, leading groups that actually do place-based work, not just work for but with communities, but a lot of understanding of what's come before. What have we inherited? What's not working? What's broken? Because as I think you'll probably hear me say a couple times, I can't help it, our systems were not designed for everybody to thrive. That is the reality. That's what this moment has revealed to us. And we've turned a blind eye, and these have evolved and intentionally, and that's why we have so many people suffering and struggling. COVID in this time just revealed that. So how do we create the system so that everybody, so this next one, humane housing, we had groups like Enterprise Housing and others saying, what is affordable, accessible housing that's well situated, quality indoor and affordable housing that is in our neighborhoods? And I've heard many of you talk about how critical this is to your economic development strategy. We've known that for years. Meaningful work and wealth, not just family sustaining, individual sustaining wages, but work that is dignified, where there's purpose and meaning and actually wealth creation strategies. So Prosperity Now and many others have looked at pivotal moves for how do we build wealth, and I know those are things that many of you in this room are working on. Whoops. Lifelong learning, looking at the life course, the first 1,000 days of life, K through 12 education, the things that we need in terms of high quality education, but emotionally supportive education, right? And what does that look like for vocational tracks? What does that look like for learning across the lifespan? We know that learning is vital to our well-being. So lots of strategies on that front, and reliable transportation, just as you would suggest. Transportation for America has been doing a lot of work in these areas and a lot of work with rural communities around what transportation. Some of you probably work with Transportation for America. And then finally at the base is belonging. We don't need any more research, although we've had a lot of it recently, that tells us how central belonging is to our well-being, our sense of belonging and inclusion. Yeah? I hear variations of that. And it's only when we have a sense of belonging can we join with others and build the civic muscle to influence the changes and to maintain those vital conditions that all of us need now and in the future. So this simple framework on these interrelated vital conditions is one way that we're thinking about how do we, and starting to act on, really boosting so that all people in all places are thriving. There's a lot on this graphic, and we'll share a lot more for those of you who are interested, but I do just want to point out that we need to put this in the context of, as you can see in that right-hand corner, our civic life. Our democracy has been challenged. Our democracy, speaking of muscle, has atrophied. What does it look like to have an inclusive civic life? And and firm democratic practices, what it looked like to renew our economic life so that we have economies that work for everybody, well-being and not adversity economies, and what does it look like to renew our social, emotional, and spiritual lives and create caring cultures. All of these pieces are fit with these vital conditions as we start to think comprehensively about what it means to really create thriving places for all people. What to me becomes really interesting, it's great that the federal government and social impact investors are using common metrics and common language and common ways of thinking about well-being and thriving. By the way, if it feels like I'm talking fast, I am, and I know that you all are exhausted. I do talk fast, but I do want to just put some ideas out there and hear some of yours. I'm really fascinated with the practice of stewardship, which is not a new term, right? It's a term that maybe some of you use, and so it's just this kind of simple definition suggests stewardship, people and organizations, anybody can be a steward, who are taking responsibility for working with others to create the conditions that we all need to thrive, starting with those who are suffering and struggling. That's what stewards are doing. And there are common practices for stewardship, and this is just the simplest version of practices for stewardship that, again, I hear in all of your work, and many of you are doing this and been doing this for decades, which is connecting across differences, using dialogue to build trust relationships. I saw somewhere on the program, I wasn't able to get there, but some folks were working with Braver Angels, which is groups that are really doing political dialogue across the red-blue divide, which also contributed to the springboard for Thriving Together. Such important work. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing. Was it met a new friend? Is it Ron from Kentucky? I don't even know if he's here in the room that devoted a whole course just to listening because we know how important it is to be listened. Desmond Tutu was just saying, you know, why did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work? Because it tapped into the most basic human need, and that is the need to be heard, to be listened to. So how do we engage unheard voices that have not been listened to? That's all within connecting across differences. How do we create opportunities? How do we start to put those strategies and the conditions in place for everybody based on living visions? How do we commit to multi-solving? I've heard in these rooms and other places in Extension really starting to connect the dots between water shortages and farmers and ranchers that are experiencing mental health challenges and opportunities to really reimagine our food systems. These intersections, they're good problems or good solutions solve multiple problems and meet multiple aspirations, right? So what does it look like to multi-solve? And how do we start to align our investments in ways that they actually add up to a difference? For the last decade, Stacy and I have had a chance to work with Kaiser Permanente. We do a lot of their community benefit work we have in the past. They do a lot of place-based work, a lot of evidence-based things that all of us have been doing around food systems, around healthy eating, active living, policy system, environmental change. And they said, you know what, a lot of it's not adding up because it's not dose-specific. We are not investing intensively enough to actually change our cultures. So how do we start to align our investments in a ways that actually add up? Because we have a lot of money that is disconnected, not very strategic, that's available to our communities right now. How do we learn and adapt? How do we make wise use of data, stories, other forms of data, other ways of knowing, and put that into place? I love the session I sat in with the journey mapping. It was a really extraordinary way of thinking about adaptive systems and thinking about really working on substance use and misuse. And so using data creatively, many of you are doing that, and finally really looking at growing stewards, pulling out our seats and creating space for more people to step into stewardship. I'm going to share with you just, a story or two around what does this look like in practice. We've got these, many of us, grand kind of sweeping frameworks. Whoops, I skipped can I go backwards? Maybe I missed a slide there. It doesn't really matter. But imagine Fox Cities is a place that Stacy and I have had a chance to work with last few years. Any folks from Wisconsin in the room? No folks from Wisconsin still left? Oh, great. Oh, hi there. So Fox Cities, Northeastern, Wisconsin, and have been doing some really extraordinary work. And they started with some of their leaders, kind of traditional, the heads of their United Ways, their economic development councils and others, and wanted to really think about a longer-term vision, and we're worried about the next generation and the lack of stewards. But we're frankly going down a path that was pretty traditional to bring together this cross-sector collaboration, but mostly folks that held power that probably were going to lead to strategies that were the same economic development strategy they've been pursuing in the past, right, to be honest. But in a moment of humility, some of the leaders said, we're going to go down this path. Let's start to really open this up. And I had a couple of slides. I don't know where they went. Say, I change them, but it doesn't matter. And they decided they were going to quickly pull seats away from the table and start to engage folks, and thousands of folks in dialogues around their well-being and people that they hadn't been in conversation with. Shift workers, the Hmong population, young LGBTQ business community that had not been invited to all these tables, and many more. And they started to learn a lot about what was really needed and what was missing in their communities, and they landed in very different places than they expected. And some of the vision, and this is just shorthand for it, is starting to imagine a place where all kids get off to strong and positive pathways, and starting to recognize how radically divergent within their region the pathways for different kids based on a lot of different factors. How they started to create an economy that could work for everyone. Like many of you were sharing, they have a massive decline in their economy based on the shift in the paper mills and some of the industries that people had leaned on. Some of you hear the term, that's sometimes people like or not, the deaths and diseases of despair. There's a lot of folks at the root of that, the lack of hope of folks that had kind of lost their industry and purpose in these places. One of our partners, by the way, is doing a lot of work on that with Pain in the Nation, that if you're interested, we can kind of send that along. And how do we create more spaces? They have a culturally rich environment, all types of outdoors activities. And in those few months in Wisconsin, when the sun is shining, they get out there and have as many festivals as possible. And so how do they create these public spaces that are more inclusive? And what they learned is that at the root of everything was belonging. They started to build all their strategies around belonging, starting to create new tables, dinners, connections across neighborhoods. Kimberly-Clark, their largest paper factory, started to create dialogues across their groups, even within their organizations. They started to create strategy with neighborhood associations, and how they started to think about more inclusion in decision-making. So belonging became a really important part of their work. And they said, if we're going to actually have any traction, we need to start measuring the same things. We need to actually have common language, common metrics. And so they started to use Cantrell's ladder to say who's suffering, who's struggling, and who's thriving across the region. And how do we start to use that to really understand who's suffering and struggling and why? And use that as in fact, this measurement system, ThedaCare, which is their largest health system, has moved towards looking at not just the social determinants and disease burden, but the vital conditions as their bridging framework. So they are looking at sub-county place-based work around these vital conditions, around lifelong learning, around meaningful work and wealth. And their health system, ThedaCare, I don't know if you've probably heard of ThedaCare, has actually, Dr. Andrabi, their CEO, has adopted thriving as their leading indicator as a health system. They're still doing all their metrics and all their HEDIS measures and all these other things that health systems do, but this is starting to align their investments and their way of thinking with other partners and with community residents. And they are leaning into really understanding belonging. This young woman here is now, Shang is leading a lot of the communications work, and this is actually a clip from a newspaper article. I don't remember all the details, but I know that Shang's father, who was a veteran of the, what war? He's served our military for years, but said in the Fox Cities areas, he was afraid to stand up when they wanted to honor veterans because of the shame it might bring him or others, because people wouldn't want him to stand up. So Shang relays this story and said, that's not the community I want to grow up in, where my father, who served our country honorably, is afraid to stand up and be honored as a veteran. And so Shang and many others are starting to say, what are the change culture that we're leading towards? And that's exactly what they're doing in Imagine Fox Cities. They're starting to change the culture around how they share power, who's sitting at the table, and where they're focusing their efforts and energies. In a month from now, Stacy and I will be witnessing their work where they actually are creating policy and investment strategies, starting to surface that with much different voices around those 4 pillars, and continuing to build the resilience around mental health and other things, and creating some really fascinating ways of placemaking. In fact, we were borrowing some of the great ideas from the big car presentation around how they can continue to lean into their placemaking efforts. This quote from, some of you may recognize the once former and now again Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. Social connection stands out as a largely unrecognized, unappreciated force for addressing many of the critical problems we're dealing with, both as individuals and as society. Overcoming loneliness and building a more connected future is an urgent mission that we can and must tackle together. Vivek is part of this interagency group for long-term recovery and resilience, has been leaning into the vital conditions. We're hoping that he will actually be participating in Imagine Fox Cities Summit. But just a reminder of how important it is for us to connect, this epidemic of isolation and loneliness. And that we have power to do something about it. That's something that we all have power to do. So at the core of a lot of the work that we do, and you can use different names for it, connecting belonging and civic muscle, our ability to work together across differences, sits in the middle of these vital conditions because the other ones are just latent potential. With belonging and civic muscle is what activates all these others. It determines whether we're actually going to be able to solve problems against these other vital conditions. So I think at the core of our work and the core of your work, and many of you, again, have been doing this for decades, is how do we grow a greater sense of belonging and how do we build our civic muscle? That's our best pathway to resilience in our country. Are you with me? And that's what you all are uniquely set up to do. That's why we're so excited to be here. I'll just share one more. How am I doing on time, friend? One more just quick story. A place that we've been fortunate to learn from over the years is in Greenville, South Carolina. Any folks from South Carolina in the room? So Greenville started from a very different place. It was a kind of traditional, they got the Social Innovation Grant, Corporation of National Service, United Way got it. It was a pretty interesting area. They were concerned about their poorest, most underserved middle schools and junior highs that were seeing young people drop out at that point. And they were, of course, looking at data retrospectively and saying it's too late, and what are we going to do about it? And so they got this grant where they're going to put an early warning system, an early detection. They called it something else. It has a new name that is escaping me at the moment. But basically looking at real-time data to look at each student's attendance, performance, behavior, these key metrics, and quickly, before things started to take a nosedive, is to build plans and support those young people and their families. And over time, that part has worked really well. But their mindset at the beginning was this was really a problem for the junior highs and the neighborhoods and the families. And even though many well-intended folks, the mindset was still that this was a problem of a problem neighborhood where folks are mostly have a lot of social pathology, and they may not say that way, but there was a mindset they would realize that they didn't start until they got proximate with these young people and proximate with their mothers or fathers or grandmothers, just the proximity of the potential that was being missed, the trapped human potential in these young people. And they started to build relationships, and they started to build relationships over the summer months with churches and seniors and volunteers that kind of tried to capture the spaces where there was lost learning. And that started to make a little bit of a difference, and it started to change people's perceptions. And so the hospital system started to see its role a little bit differently, the community benefit. And they started to realize that their real role was to start to build the vital conditions around these neighborhoods where these young people were having so much problem struggling. They could have hired more reading coaches, which would have been a reasonable thing. They could have hired more teachers. The teachers were stretched. But that really wasn't the solution here if they were going to start to go graduation rates. So there's a lot of data on the slide I want to unpack, but as you start to imagine how they started to think about investing in housing, how they started to connect these neighborhoods to green spaces and the hospital's trail so that they were connected to other vibrant parts in the community, which they were completely disconnected from. They started looking at the legacies of exclusion and decision-making in many cases. And businesses, instead of just saying, you know what, our metric is just to hit graduation rate and these kids can go on and even though they graduate, don't have any other opportunities, is say we're going to step up as a business community and we're going to start to offer paid internships and vocational pathways and start to look at how we meet our economic development needs with these young people. That's our opportunity. And how do we do it with a sense of belonging? So this isn't about doing everything. It's about connecting the dots. It's about opening our aperture for what's possible when we start to kind of put the puzzle pieces together. So let me just zoom out real quickly because we could all tell stories around what it looks like for the snowball effect when a community actually turns towards each other to solve problems. What does it take to thrive? I think there's a dynamic that we are seeing that we need to really pay attention to around thriving, suffering, struggling. One is the vital conditions, of course, that we talked about that everybody needs, whether you use that precise language or not. And we're seeing massive urgent needs, urgent services, food security, housing insecurity, loss of wages and jobs, all these things that we've been talking about in this conference. One of the tricks is how do we balance a portfolio of investing in really meeting with human dignity, the urgent services, without putting all of our eggs in that basket? How do we simultaneously start to invest in the vital conditions at the same time? That's one of the important art and science of how do we create thriving communities. Otherwise, as you can see down in that right-hand corner, we will create adversity economies. We will build an economy, and we will basically institutionalize adversity. And we work a lot with health systems across the country, and that's exactly what happened when we created a sick care system, right? We've incentivized an economy based on adversity. So the question is, how do we start to create a virtuous cycle around a well-being economy where investment in the vital conditions actually is incentivized and accrues all types of benefits, most importantly to thriving people and places? And there's a lot of work. There's a lot of economic development specialists here that know across the globe, and in some areas in the United States, we're starting to build well-being economies. To do that, I want to go all the way to the left side of that screen and say it's only possible. One of the things that's been a massive blind spot for our country, and I'm going to say for myself and even community initiatives over time, is we have not acknowledged the legacies that we've inherited from our ancestors and how we situate those in the strategies that we developed. Whether it's way back with understanding where our systems form with exclusive practices or commandeering land, whether it's redlining, whether it's other forms of exclusions of not allowing folks educational opportunity or housing opportunities, particularly people of color, but not only in our country, but also recognizing that we have incredible assets in the form of dignity and inclusion that are part of our legacies that we can build on. Every community has incredible cultural amenities. All these things that we're seeing in Indianapolis are amazing assets that are legacies of years that we can be building on. And so we would just say that it's the role. Let me just say this. We cannot urgent service our way into thriving. That's the one thing that we are really clear with our modeling and with our own experiences, that we can keep investing. We might be able to move somebody from struggling to suffering, but we're not able to move people into thriving. And if we don't do that, we basically are situated with a country where we have basically trapped human potential. And that's what we have when half of our country is suffering and struggling. And it's the role of stewards and the role of stewardship that we see as really the critical. These ideas are great all day long, but until we have stewardship and stewardship practices to start to really act on this, to open up the aperture, we're not going to have thriving communities. The good news is it's within our reach. And I'm going to pass it to my colleague Stacy as maybe just as a name this. These are kind of the things that we see in stewardship, to affirm human dignity, just like we're seeing in all the places. I mean, these are things that stewards have to do. Strengthen belonging and civic muscle. Starting to expand those interrelated vital conditions and not see these as separate entities and start to solidify around new legacies of inclusion and well-being and justice. It's happening. It's possible. It's within our reach. And Extension is doing some of this. And we've had the privilege of working with Extension on a couple of these fronts. And so I'm going to ask Stacy to maybe help lead us in kind of thinking a little bit of a dialogue on that.
I'm going to check my mic, and I'm assuming we probably shouldn't dance too closely together to save everyone's ears. Thanks, Monte. As Monte said, just so tremendous to be here with you all and learning with you all. And I'm excited to be able to lift up just a handful of the tremendous signs of momentum, many of which you all are very much a part of. On the top left, the Build Healthy Places Network, they were just finishing 2 years of work for policy scans and doing story catching for communities around the country for the work that was being done and progress that was being made. And as the springboard for Thriving Together came out and the vital conditions framework was made more visible, what they heard and what they learned mapped so clearly to that framework because it's the experience of community and how often we do work in community. And so as they published that report, they actually organized their recommendations around the vital conditions for thriving together and adopted that North Star of all people and all places thriving, no exceptions. As we bounce down to the lower row, sort of the third item across there, the National Civic League. The National Civic League last winter, with their edition of the review, dedicated the entire edition to conversations and articles around what it will take for the renewal of our communities. What is that social, economic, spiritual renewal that's needed? Talking about the role of arts in community as a part of that. Talking about reimagining what capitalism looks like to be inclusive of all. And lifting up the art of dialogue, which again you all have been in and used so regularly to help better connect us in our work. The bottom left, we've been fortunate to get to know some of the folks across the Social Impact Exchange. This is a network, a group of more than 400 foundations, social impact investors, and businesses. They regularly gather and dedicate themselves to new field learning, and they've picked up Thriving Together and the Vital Conditions framework as they think really about how they do their community level and their collective investments to really create and advance the conditions, those vital conditions that we all need every day to be able to thrive. And I think perhaps you still have the clicker. May I? Thanks. Because I wouldn't want anyone to miss my highlight circles. All right, in the top row there across, and many of you hopefully already are using and recognize this. Your National Cooperative Extension just released a new national framework about a year ago, which centers health equity, which names the need to be able to support field staff and faculty in doing this work differently in community. We think about how success is measured and what is needed in the way of systems change so that we can do this longer arc work. What's needed as we continue to bring in new professionals and grow the capacity and connect the dots and share and exchange the wisdom of the work that you all are doing in community. Well-Connected Communities is a Robert Wood Johnson funded initiative. They've made, I think we're in sort of year 5 of what's anticipated to be a 10-year commitment from Robert Wood Johnson, who understands the power and the opportunity that is national extension, having trusted professionals and community members in counties all across the country, and with a tremendous role of 4-H and the deep intergenerational work that gets done across cooperative extension and 4-H. The Well-Connected Communities Group has been doing a variety of community change initiatives, Purdue, Wisconsin. There are others, Tennessee State, who may be in the room and across your system who are participating. And this year, one of the key pieces of work in what we continue to sort of hear as being needed to step into this is we need to be able to see that journey a little differently. We are absolutely phenomenal in delivering programs and being able to move and change individual behavior, but those folks are still trying to, carry out and live those new behaviors and systems, as Monte lifted up, that are still not working for all of us. So how do we align those programs to be able to also be invested in and help pull the levers for that system change? So with a number of voices that are even in the room, and Patty and Michael Wilcox and Mike Gaffney and many others, thank you so much, who are helping to shape and inform, and we look forward to circling back to an invitation for you all to be able to be added to that work. But imagining a playbook, not that gets printed into a PDF and bound and that sits dusty on a shelf that we all have so many of, but really to be able to leverage an online community and hub for which over time those key practices, the lifting up and making visible the stories of this work. We always hear, right, like that sounds great, I want to do that. What does that actually look like? What does it look like in a community that's similar to mine? And to have that be a living body of work that can continue to grow and change over time. And our friends at Colorado State University, CSU has recently, with the new president, really doubled down on a commitment and called for courageous action around advancing more inclusive, resilient, and vibrant communities. And the group with Blake Norton and Patty and Sue Schneider have been working to expand their rural health initiative, and of course starting with deep listening. And Monte and I have been very fortunate to be able to be walking alongside as at this point they've gathered more than 65 voices across faculty and community field staff and the centers as well as external partners, and really listening about what's needed. Where are those new opportunities for collaboration, for changing the table for that work? imagining that it'll be focused around mental health and aging, and that a key foundation and through thread, as Monte had named, is really going to be continuing to build the civic muscle for creating change. Monte and I, at this point, would really love to be able to turn the conversation back to you all in the room, knowing that in working together, we really do have the opportunity to create a better future for all. We've got two big questions. And when I say big, I mean big questions. What can you imagine as possible for growing, belonging, and civic muscle? Like, bust through those first few things that come up, right? That series of barriers as we start to imagine anew. We often have, like, those walls, our bureaucracies, again, the other challenges that come up. See through and beyond those for a minute, because we first have to be able to see it and then speak it with one another before we can begin to achieve it. And then what are you seeing currently that's bringing you hope as an individual and in your work? We want each of you to take just 1 or 2 minutes first to sort of have an opportunity to take a deep breath and to look inward, to think about where you are with those questions, what you might imagine as possible for yourselves, for the extension system. Jot a few notes, type it in your phone if you've got laptops going. And after a minute or two, we're going to have you all pair up and really share and exchange some of those stories. We'll have 7-8 minutes or so to really be able to listen to one another, bringing that wisdom that you arrived with and all that you've gathered as you've been here together over the last few days, and share and exchange, and we'll have an opportunity to lift up and to capture what this group is seeing as possible. So if you'll take just a minute or two to make those personal reflections, what's possible for growing, belonging, and civic muscle, and what's bringing you hope.